Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight we're stepping into one of humanity's darkest chapters. Not the sanitized version from textbooks with noble knights and fair maidens, but the grim reality of 14th century Europe during the Black Death. You might think modern medicine has prepared you for anything, but trust me, there's a reason they called it the Great Mortality. If you're finding value in these deep dives into history's harsh truths, a like really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing our community span the globe. Now settle in, maybe grab some tea, and let's journey back to a time when death stalked every street corner.
Congratulations, you've just awakened in Europe, 1348, the year the Black Death arrived and changed everything forever. Your first sensation isn't what you'd expect. It's the overwhelming stench that hits you like a physical blow. Not just unwashed bodies, though that's certainly part of it, but something far more sinister, the sweet, cloying smell of decay that hangs over every settlement like a poisonous fog. You see, by this point in the pandemic, bodies are piling up faster than they can be buried. The church graveyards filled months ago, and now mass graves, enormous pits, dominate the landscape outside every town. Sometimes, these pits hold hundreds of corpses, layered like cordwood and covered with quicklime when available.
As you drag yourself from your straw mattress, likely crawling with fleas, the very creatures spreading this nightmare, every joint in your body screams with pain. But this isn't just the usual medieval aches from hard labor. No, you're experiencing the early stages of what contemporaries called the sweating sickness, or the pestilence. Modern historians know it as bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. But medieval people had no understanding of germs or infection vectors. The plague manifested in three horrifying forms. Bubonic plague caused massive, painful swellings called buboes in your lymph nodes. Imagine golf ball-sized lumps in your armpits, groin, and neck that burned like fire and leaked pus and blood. Pneumonic plague attacked your lungs, causing you to cough up blood while drowning in your own fluid-filled airways. And septicemic plague poisoned your blood directly, turning your skin black with necrosis before you died, often within hours.
Standing on the dirt floor of your hovel, you notice the bitter cold seeping through the walls. Medieval homes offered minimal protection from the elements. Most were single-room structures shared by entire families, sometimes including livestock for warmth. Windows, if they existed, were just holes in the wall, maybe covered with oiled cloth. Glass was a luxury, reserved for churches and the very wealthy. But the cold is the least of your worries. You're sharing this space with the perfect storm of plague transmission. Rats, fleas, and other humans in close quarters with no understanding of hygiene or disease prevention.
Your stomach contracts with hunger, but food has become scarce and dangerous. With so many farmers dead or fleeing, crops rotted in fields during the 1348 harvest. What food remained was often contaminated, stored in the same spaces where infected grain attracted plague-carrying rats. The medieval diet was already monotonous: dark bread, thin porridge, and whatever vegetables survived the failing harvest. Fresh meat was a distant memory for most people. Salt pork and dried fish, when available, came at prices that would bankrupt ordinary families. Trading ships that normally brought exotic spices and preserved goods from distant lands lay rotting in harbors, their crews dead at the oars.
Before venturing outside, you'd need to understand that the very air was considered poisonous. Medieval people believed in miasma, bad air that carried disease. They weren't entirely wrong, though they didn't understand the mechanism. Physicians recommended carrying flowers or herbs to ward off the poisonous vapors. Roses, lavender, and rosemary were particularly prized, leading some to carry small bouquets or wear sachets of aromatic herbs. The wealthy might afford exotic substances like frankincense or myrrh, burning them constantly in their homes.
Stepping into the street, you're confronted with scenes that would haunt you forever. Bodies lay where they fell,
sometimes for days before removal. The few people you encounter exhibit a range of responses to the apocalypse unfolding around them. The psychological responses varied dramatically. Some turned to extreme religious practices, believing increased devotion might provide protection. Groups of religious extremists engaged in public displays of penance, often harming themselves in the process. Others abandoned traditional moral codes entirely, reasoning that normal rules no longer applied in such desperate times.
Perhaps most tragically, the plague unleashed humanity's darkest impulses. Unfortunately, minority communities became scapegoats during this crisis, falsely blamed for the pandemic's spread. Historical records document tragic persecution, driven by fear and misinformation, rather than facts. These events represent some of history's darkest moments of how panic can override reason and compassion during times of crisis.
If you decided to seek help from a physician, assuming you could find one still alive, you'd encounter medical practices that seem barbaric today, but represented the height of medieval knowledge. Medical treatments of the era would seem shocking by today's standards. Bloodletting was considered essential for balancing the body's humors. Doctors would make incisions to drain what they believed was corrupted blood, though this actually weakened patients when they needed strength most. Other treatments included burning aromatic substances to purify the air or consuming expensive compounds believed to have healing properties.
The famous plague doctor costume, with its leather beak filled with herbs, came later. But even basic medical practitioners covered their faces and avoided direct contact when possible. They charged enormous fees for house calls, knowing they might not survive to collect payment. Most physicians fled cities entirely when the plague arrived, leaving the population to fend for themselves with folk remedies and prayer.
As you walk through what remains of the town, you pass buildings that should be bustling with activity, but now stand empty. The baker's shop is shuttered. The entire family died within a week of each other. The blacksmith's forge is cold. He was one of the first to succumb, and no one dared take over his contaminated workspace. Markets, if they operated at all, saw prices skyrocket for basic necessities. A loaf of bread might cost a week's wages, if you could find someone still baking. The social fabric was unraveling before your eyes. Entire monasteries, the medieval world's centers of learning and healthcare, were wiped out. In some regions, up to 90% of clergy died. They were on the front lines, giving last rites and tending to the sick. With priests gone, who would perform the essential sacraments that medieval people believed were necessary for salvation? Some villages hadn't seen a priest in months, leaving the dying without spiritual comfort.
Law and order had virtually collapsed. Courts couldn't convene when judges, clerks, and witnesses were dead or dying. Property ownership became meaningless when there was no one left to inherit or enforce claims. Entire noble lineages were extinguished, leaving vast estates abandoned and reverting to wilderness. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on the few travelers brave or desperate enough to venture between settlements. Perhaps you'd consider fleeing to the countryside, thinking rural areas might be safer. But the plague followed every trade route and river, spreading along the very networks that connected medieval Europe. Rural areas actually suffered higher mortality rates in some regions because they lacked the few medical resources concentrated in cities. Entire villages were abandoned, their populations either dead or scattered to the winds. You might try joining a group of survivors heading toward rumored safe havens, perhaps a remote monastery that claimed divine protection, or a distant city that supposedly had found a cure. But travel itself was treacherous. Roads were clogged with the desperate and dying. Inns and hostels had closed or had become charnel houses where guests checked in but never checked out. Clean water was increasingly difficult to find as wells became contaminated with runoff from mass graves. The psychological toll was immense. Chroniclers describe a world where normal human bonds dissolved. Family bonds, normally the strongest social ties, often couldn't survive the terror of infection. Historical accounts describe heartbreaking situations where relatives abandoned each other due to fear. As one chronicler noted about Florence, family members often had to make impossible choices between caring for loved ones and protecting themselves from disease.
The few medical practitioners who remained alive documented the plague's progression with clinical detachment that masked their horror. They noted how quickly the disease progressed. A person might wake feeling fine, develop fever by midday, see buboes appear by evening, and be dead before the next dawn. The speed of death meant there was rarely time for elaborate farewells or proper preparation for the afterlife.
Economic systems that had taken centuries to develop crumbled within months. The complex web of feudal obligations that structured medieval society became meaningless when half the participants were dead. Serfs who survived found themselves in demand and could negotiate better terms with desperate landowners. But this economic revolution offered cold comfort to those watching their families die around them.
As evening approaches, you seek shelter wherever you can find it. Abandoned houses stand with their doors ajar, their former occupants having fled or died. You might take refuge in such a place, but the silence is oppressive. No children's laughter, no conversation over evening meals, no domestic sounds that make a house a home. Just the whisper of wind through empty rooms and the scurrying of rats that have grown bold in humanity's absence.
The darkness brings no peace. Sleep is interrupted by fever dreams and the very real sounds of suffering echoing through thin walls. You might wake to find that someone who seemed healthy yesterday is now burning with fever, their lymph nodes swelling visibly as the bacteria multiply in their system. The progression is relentless and terrifying to witness.
Night sounds in plague-stricken Europe were unlike anything before or since. The constant ringing of church bells for the dead created a cacophony of mourning that echoed across every settlement. Death carts made their rounds, wheels creaking under the weight of corpses. The wailing of mourners, when anyone remained to mourn, provided a soundtrack of despair that seemed to emanate from the very earth.
By morning, perhaps a third of your neighbors are dead or dying. This isn't hyperbole. The Black Death killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. Some regions lost up to 90% of their inhabitants. Entire villages vanished so completely that their locations are still unknown today. Archaeological evidence shows settlements that simply ended in the mid-14th century, their inhabitants leaving behind pottery, tools, and personal belongings that tell the story of lives abruptly cut short. The few survivors faced a world transformed beyond recognition. Labor shortages led to social upheaval as peasants demanded higher wages and better conditions. The rigid feudal system began cracking under demographic pressure. Surviving workers could pick and choose their employers and siblings.
Agricultural knowledge was lost when entire communities of farmers died. Techniques for crop rotation, animal husbandry, and land management that had been passed down through generations vanished overnight. Some regions took decades to recover their agricultural productivity, leading to periodic famines even after the plague subsided.
Craftsmanship suffered similar losses. Master artisans who had spent decades perfecting their skills died before they could train successors. Guild systems that regulated quality and training collapsed when too few members survived to maintain standards. Some specialized trades disappeared entirely from certain regions, their knowledge dying with their practitioners. The psychological scars ran deep in survivors. Many developed what we might recognize today as post-traumatic stress disorder. They became obsessed with death, commissioning elaborate memento mori art that depicted the inevitability of mortality. Dance macabre, or dances of death, became popular artistic themes, showing death claiming people from all walks of life. This wasn't morbid fascination, but a society trying to process trauma on an unprecedented scale. Some women found themselves in new roles as traditional family structures collapsed. Despite having no formal medical training, many became primary caregivers when trained physicians were unavailable. Others gained unexpected independence as widows inherited businesses or property, though this came at the terrible cost of losing their families. Children who survived often did so as orphans, creating a generation raised by strangers or struggling alone. Many never learned basic skills their parents would have taught them. Literacy rates, already low, plummeted further as schools closed and tutors died. The careful preservation and copying of manuscripts that kept knowledge alive through the medieval period nearly collapsed in some regions.
As you reflect on another day survived in this hellscape, you realize that every assumption about normal life has crumbled. There are no emergency services to call, no hospitals with modern equipment, no understanding of germ theory or antibiotics. You're facing a pandemic with medieval technology and knowledge, and the odds are overwhelmingly against your survival.
The wind howls through the cracks in your shelter, carrying with it the ever-present smell of death and the whispered prayers of the few survivors. Tomorrow, if it comes, will bring new horrors and perhaps new deaths. In the Black Death's Europe, hope was a luxury few could afford, and survival was a daily miracle that fewer and fewer could achieve.
Even if you somehow possessed modern knowledge about disease transmission and hygiene, implementing that knowledge would be nearly impossible. How do you maintain sterile conditions without soap, running water, or disinfectants? How do you social distance in a world where people huddle together for warmth and survival? How do you explain germ theory to people who believe illness comes from bad air or divine punishment? Even if you somehow possessed modern knowledge about disease transmission and hygiene, implementing that knowledge would be nearly impossible. How do you maintain sterile conditions without soap, running water, or disinfectants? How do you social distance in a world where people huddle together for warmth and survival? How do you explain germ theory to people who believe illness comes from bad air or divine punishment?
The morning light, if you live to see it, will illuminate a world forever changed, where the very concept of normal has been redefined by humanity's encounter with one of history's most devastating pandemics. The Black Death wasn't just a medical crisis, it was the complete breakdown of civilization as medieval Europe knew it. The plague's aftermath would shape European culture for centuries. The massive population loss led to labor shortages that empowered surviving workers and began dismantling feudalism. The Catholic Church's inability to protect the faithful or explain the catastrophe damaged its absolute authority and contributed to later religious reforms. Art, literature, and philosophy all bore the mark of a society that had stared into the abyss and barely survived. But none of that broader historical impact matters when you're lying in a medieval hovel, burning with fever, watching black swellings appear on your body, and knowing that medical help consists of bloodletting and prayer. This content explores historical events for educational purposes, helping us understand how past societies faced overwhelming challenges. The Black Death represents one of history's most significant demographic and social upheavals, and studying these events helps us appreciate both human resilience and the importance of medical advancement. While we examine these difficult topics, we do so to learn from history rather than to sensationalize suffering. As consciousness fades and the fever rises, your last thoughts might be of loved ones already lost, of a world that no longer makes sense, and of the cruel randomness that determines who lives and who becomes another unmarked grave in the endless cemetery that Europe has become. In the Black Death's merciless grip, survival wasn't about strength or virtue. It was about pure, inexplicable luck that ran out for most people who drew breath in that terrible century.